Are you new to Posca markers and you're not sure how to get started? Or you try painting with the pens and you're not really happy with the results? If this sounds like you, then my friend, you're in the right place. In this video, I'm covering the 12 common Posca marker mistakes that will ruin your artwork. And I'll be sharing how to avoid these mistakes from happening. So if you're a beginner or a veteran artist, this video is for you. Also, make sure you watch this video to the end because there could be one piece of information that can help you take your art to the next level. Starting off with mistake number 1, and that's shaking your marker with the cap off.
So why is this important? And that's because in order to activate the markers, you must first do these two things. First, you must press on your brush nib about 3 or 4 times. Then you're going to shake your pen between 5 or 10 seconds just to get the paint flowing. So now, if you're shaking your pen while your cap is absent,
this may result in paint splattering all over your paper, all over your room, or even worse, your artwork. So I would suggest shaking your Posca marker with the cap on to avoid this from happening. Now let's move on to our next mistake, and that's applying too much pressure when you're painting.
This is what you need to keep in mind. So anytime you press down on your nib, you're telling your marker to provide you with more paint. The longer you hold down the nib, the more paint that's going to flow at the marker.
So I know when I first started, I made the huge mistake of pressing down as I was painting my artwork.
And boy, let me tell you what happened. After a few seconds of coloring, I had a pool of paint all over my drawing. In fact, it was so bad that I unfortunately had to start all over.
So let me tell you what I did to stop this.
I would paint as light as possible in a fluid motion. Coloring this way allowed me to control how much paint was coming out of my marker.
So while we're on the subject of ink, this leads us to our third mistake, and that's layering colors while the paint is wet.
So here's what you need to know. When you apply your Posca marker over wet paint, instead of creating a new layer, you're going to end up blending the colors. Now, this might sound pretty cool if you intended to create a gradient. However, if you're not aware that this can happen, you might end up muddying up your colors and creating a huge mess. So here is how you stop this from happening.
If you want to be able to paint and use solid color for your entire painting, you're going to have to wait until your colors dry. So while we're on the topic of colors, let's move on to mistake number 4, and that's not testing out your colors before using them. So I remember when I first started, I used to rely on the color on the cap just so I knew what paint I was using. So unfortunately for me, this led to many mistakes on my paintings. For example, I would have blues that were darker than it needed to be. I also had reds that were just too bright. And the worst thing of all, it caused me to have to do my painting all over again.
Okay, so now let me show you this essential tool that I use that stops me from making any coloring mistakes. And it's called the color cheat sheet. And I like to think of it like a coloring roadmap for each marker that I'm about to use. So let me show you how I make one. So first off, I like to use a scrap piece of paper, preferably the same paper that I'm painting the design with. Then I would draw little circles or little squares of each color that I plan to use. I would also write down the marker's name for each color. Doing this helps keep me super organized. I also paint out different shades for every color, just so I know what paint to use when it's time to start coloring my highlights and my shading.
This leads us to mistake number 5, and that's using the wrong paper.
So let's dive into why this is so important. So Posca markers contain a water-based paint inside of it. And unfortunately, most lightweight paper are not built to handle the layers of paint. So what are the common issues that may happen? First up, we have bleeding. And this happens when your paint starts to seep through your paper until it bleeds to the other side. And trust me when I say this, you definitely don't want that. So the question is, what's the best paper for you to use so you can avoid this from happening to you? Me personally, I'm a big fan of any heavyweight paper. I think any mixed media or bristle paper will do just fine. I actually just created a new sketchbook for anybody who's looking for a great paper where you'll be able to sketch and paint at the same time. And you can get more info on that in the description.
So now let's talk about the brushes, or should I say the nibs. For mistake number 6 is using the wrong pen for your artwork. So for the people who don't know, Posca markers comes in different sizes, from small all the way to large, and it all depends on the size of artwork that you're working on. So I would suggest using the correct nib for the type of artwork you're trying to do. Use small nibs whenever you're trying to do something very detailed. Use big brushes, or should I say big nibs, whenever you're trying to cover a large piece of space. This will help you to not wasting your pen, not wasting your paint, and to create the best artwork possible. So before I jump into my next point, I just want to remind you guys to make sure you subscribe to the channel. You definitely don't want to miss what we have coming in the future. A lot more videos catered to you to help you become the best artist that you can be. So while we're on the topic of nibs, next up we have our next mistake, and that's not cleaning your nibs after painting.
So why is cleaning your Posca nibs important? The answer really comes down to how these markers function. The acrylic paint inside the markers dry very quickly, and all the colors are opaque, which means the colors are not transparent. Now, for example, let's say you don't clean your nib after using a dark color, and then you decide to start painting with a lighter shade. There's a good chance that you will mistakenly carry over that previous color, and this mistake could ruin the colors in your painting, or even worse, ruin your entire design. So now I'm going to show you how you can stop this from happening, and I'm also going to share a few ways you can clean your nib.
So you can go ahead and remove the nib, drop it into a glass of warm water for 2 or 3 minutes, swirl it around, and that should be enough to get rid of any unwanted color. Or you can remove your nib, put it under the sink, and let warm water soak it until you see the color come off. Next up, we have our next mistake, and that's overworking the surface. Posca markers have a rough nib, and it'll rip any paper if you go over the same spot too many times. I would suggest to gently paint your designs in a light, fluid motion. Trust me, your paper will thank you. And that brings us to mistake number 9, and that is painting before your line art dries. Unfortunately, painting too quickly can cause your line art to blend into your painting. I can't stress this enough. Patience is your friend. What I like to do is I like to draw my line art and give it about 5 or 10 minutes for it to dry. This guarantees that my line art doesn't blend into my painting. And this brings us to mistake number 10, which is blending colors while your paint is dry. Posca marker paint dries very quickly and won't blend with other colors when it does. The best way to blend colors in your artwork is to do it while the paint is wet to achieve the smooth transition so you can create the best gradients. Moving on to our next mistake, I think this is a simple one but very, very important, and that's not having a sketch or an outline before you start painting.
So why is sketching your artwork so important before you start diving into your painting? Well, I'm going to break it down in a few parts. First up, we have avoiding mistakes. I personally like to look at the sketch as a guide that helps me to reduce any chances of me making a mistake that's going to be a pain to correct later on. Also, having a sketch helps me to plan out my colors before I even dive into my design, which in the end saves me so much time.
And finally, for our last mistake, is forgetting to recap your marker. I cannot stress this enough. Whenever you're done painting, you need to put the caps back on. I remember the other day I left a few of my markers and I didn't put the cap on and they dried out in less than 24 hours. For those who don't know, Posca markers are very, very expensive. And the one thing you do not want to do is have to spend more money to get new ones, only because you forgot to put the caps on. And there you have it. Those are the 12 common Posca marker mistakes that will ruin your artwork. So remember, when it comes to art, it's all about learning and improving. So if you made any of these mistakes, just chalk it up as a learning lesson. Now, with that being said, if you're ready to continue learning about how to use Posca markers and how you can master your craft, I have good news for you. We have another video up on screen that'll be able to help you make that happen.